When looking at all of the builds that seemed promising for League start choices in Affliction League, the one that stood out to me above all others was the Summon Raging Spirits Guardian. The main reason being that this is one of the absolute easiest builds to clear through the campaign and early maps with that has as little hassle and difficulty as possible. My one and only goal with this particular League Start guide was to make the path of building as detailed as possible to be able to answer any questions that you might have. No websites, no videos you have to reference, just one path of building link with absolutely everything that you could need. And if I did happen to miss anything or you have any questions, I will have a dedicated thread on my Discord linked in the description to this build that I will be answering questions in as I get time. And then I will use any of those relevant questions to update the path of building. Please keep the questions to that thread, however. You can talk in the rest of the channels, but don't pollute them with questions about various builds. I will also be live for League Start, so feel free to ask me questions on either of my streams at YouTube or Twitch. Now, if you're new to the channel, make sure that you subscribe, and without further ado, let's get into it. Before we begin, I do want to give a quick shout out to a few people's builds or strategies that I referenced for the creation of this build guide. Thanks to Ben, FaZe Plays, and Tai Killer for their takes on this build, as well as some leveling strategies and other things that I used. Now, let's talk about all the choices that I made for my version of this build. SRS Guardian is a minion build, however, not all minions are created equally. For this build, I have decided against including Spectres or an Animate Guardian. These minions are difficult to keep alive in a League Start scenario and require extensive time and investment to maintain. The bonuses from these minions are somewhat substantial, but for the payoff, in my opinion, it's not worth the headache. The minions that we have decided to use are the Sentinel of Radiance, Elemental Relics, Summon Raging Spirits, and a Carrion Golem. Starting out with the Sentinel of Radiance. This is what I would consider the cornerstone of this build. It's a large temporary minion that protects you from a portion of damage, deals massive, almost screen-wide AoE fire damage based on its life, and has a very high damaging melee attack. This minion is slow, and you will need to use Convocation early on to have him keep up with you, but he will be hard carrying you through the campaign as well as early maps. Elemental Relics are spawned or refreshed whenever you or your minions kill an enemy or hit a rare unique monster. These minions are defensive and give absolutely massive bonuses to you and all of your minions. There are 3 total, and they give the equivalent of a level 27 Hatred, Anger, and Wrath aura, which is an absolutely massive amount of damage. Summon Raging Spirits are the main ability of this build. You're able to have 20 of these out at any given time, and we use the Unleash support gem to both make it easier to maintain all 20, as well as giving us time to cast our other abilities. These are short duration temporary minions that will seek out whatever enemy you target them with. These minions deal high single target damage, and when linked with Melee Splash also have excellent capabilities of clearing. And lastly, we have the Carrion Golem. We're using this as a support minion to provide a few separate but important buffs. Naturally, this minion provides additional physical damage to all of your other minions, but we also link it with Feeding Frenzy, which provides us extra damage to our minions, as well as Elemental Army, which with the help of the Anger and Wrath buffs is able to provide exposure to both lightning and fire, causing our minions to deal more damage. Now moving on to our defensive layers, I've decided on a mix of spell suppression, block, armor, and evasion, as well as a cast when damage taken Molten Shell as a last line of defense. Spell suppression is a very powerful effect that prevents the damage taken from all spells by a flat 50%. The most dangerous abilities in Path of Exile tend to be spells, and reducing their effectiveness by half is potentially one of the strongest defensive layers in the game. Early game, we use the chance to suppress spell damage as Lucky Mastery to get as high of spell suppression as possible. Later, through more gear and potentially Affliction Ascendancies, we will be able to reach 100% chance without the need of this mastery. This effectively makes it so that we just take overall 50% less damage from spells. The next defensive layer is Block and Spell Block. These are preventative damage layers, giving us a chance to completely avoid the damage from attacks or spells. The Guardian naturally has this mechanic baked into its Ascendancy, so this is an obvious add-in as a defensive layer, and we also reinforce our spell block chance with the Tempest Shield aura. We will be using a Recover Life on Block Shield to smooth out recovery in later mapping until we are able to invest into more significant damage reduction in the very late game. Next is going to be Armor, which provides us defense against physical damage of all kinds, and it is more effective the smaller that the hit is. The main main purpose of armor here is to make sure that any physical spells or attacks that do manage to get through our defenses don't one-shot us. We scale armor on our gear, as well as use the Determination Aura and Defiance banner to scale it even further. Next is Evasion, and that provides us an additional layer to avoiding attacks alongside block. With the combo of attack block and evasion, we have a much smaller chance of attacks ever connecting with our character, providing us significant tankiness against attacks. We scale evasion through our gear, as well as the Grace Aura and Defiance banner to help scale it even further. And our last line of defense is Molten Shell. This is used with a support called Cast When Damage Taken. What this does is when you take a certain amount of damage, it triggers the connected spell. We set this Cast When Damage Taken to be roughly a third of our health, so that it gives us a bit of a buffer to any damage that comes after a big hit. Now when we talk about offensive layers, minion builds scale things a little bit differently. We do have built-in generic minion stats such as minion damage and minion attack speed, which are both going to help influence the damage of our minions. And our Sentinel of Radiance of course does scale off of minion health as well. Beyond that, we are going to have to scale the damage of our minions through buffs on them as well as debuffs on the enemy. For buffs, we use things like auras from our Relics, the Haste Aura, Feeding Frenzy from our Golem, and Offerings. For debuffs on enemies, we use things like Fire and Lightning exposure as well as our curses. For moving around, we're going to use Shield Charge for general movement around areas. This ability requires a shield and scales with both your attack speed and your movement speed. Things like Quicksilver Flasks and Movement Speed Boots help scale this ability faster. This ability does have a tendency to get stuck on things, but with a little bit of practice, it is one of the fastest movement abilities in the game. For crossing gaps, we're going to be using the Flame Dash ability. This ability is notably faster if you only use it sparingly, as repeated uses will incur a cast time and take significantly longer to complete, so try to only use this occasionally for the strongest effect. Now talking about leveling, once you obtain the Sentinel of Radiance, you essentially are just going to allow it to carry you and shield charge through maps. However, before that, you're going to have two choices. The intended path of this build is to use Rolling Magma as well as Holy Flame Totem and Flame Wall to quickly progress through the first two acts. These abilities scale extremely well early on and are super effective at dishing out damage while being on the move. This path that you'll follow will require 6 total respec points at around the end of Act 4, which should be easily obtainable, and then it transitions into Summon Raging Spirits. Alternatively, if you are okay with going a bit slower, you can level with the main skill Summon Raging Spirits right from the get-go. This ability will be a bit frustrating early on as the minions have a tendency to die and aren't able to do their damage if they're dead. We do use an additional minion to attempt to keep them alive, but it only works so well. However, minimal to no respec points will be required for this path, and you do get to use the main ability of the build. However, once you do obtain the Sentinel of Radiance, it will be smooth sailing through the entire campaign and early maps. You'll transition to Unleash SRS at level 38, which will assist greatly in single target damage, but for the most part, you're just going to be shield charging through zones, using Convocation on left click, and letting your Sentinel carry you all the way through. Now that you have an idea of how this build performs, what it does, and what kind of abilities that it uses, and whether or not you think that you'd like to play it, let's talk a little bit about this path of building. I have spent an absurd amount of time over the last probably 3 or 4 days trying to refine this as best I can. I do want to go quickly through all aspects of this so you know what you're looking for. This can be like a companion alongside you doing your league start. The majority of people, as long as you are not a absolutely brand new player, shouldn't need any other resources besides this POB to get through your league start. So let's talk a little bit about what we've got here. So as always, any league start build guide for me is going to have extensive leveling trees. This time around, I did mention that there is both a Rolling Magma start as well as a Summon Raging Spirit start. There are separate league start trees for each of these different starts. For example, if you're going to be starting with Rolling Magma, you'll be moving out, grabbing elemental damage here, and moving into some more elemental damage nodes. These are going to make it so that you will end up doing a little bit more damage. We move over towards the left here, grabbing a bunch of these life nodes, some minion nodes, and then all the way up towards spiritual aid. This makes it so that we don't need to worry too much about scaling any other kind of damage. We can just scale minion damage, have it affect us until we're ready to swap over into our full minion build and not have that many respec points. Following this up is when you're going to start using some auras, so we'll grab Sovereignty as well as these reservation efficiency nodes, as well as some life and some recovery. From this point, you will be swapping over into SRS, and if you notice, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 respec points. So what you will do is you'll respec these 3 points, you'll put in these 3 points here, and then you'll respec these 3 points and fill in the masteries and nodes as you move along. Alternatively, if you do want to start as SRS, note that I think this is the worst of the two methods of league starting. SRS is a little bit rough early game. However, it is doable. You'll notice that we come out through minion damage, grab some life and dexterity, move up towards these minion duration nodes, as these are extremely important for SRS, making it so that you can have as many of them alive at a time, and then moving through some of the similar nodes that you would have seen before, scaling some minion damage, getting some auras, and moving into the same nodes. Beyond that, these two trees do conjoin at around the end of Act 4, moving over towards the right, with our first main goal being to get Eldritch Battery. You will also be dropping this life mastery. Before this, we do have this skills cost life instead of mana, because mana can be a little bit problematic for some people. A lot of people don't really like using a mana flask all the time, so this will help out a little bit with that. However, we just move through all of these trees, getting into the end game, going into white maps, yellow maps, and red maps, and finishing out with a small respec. This respec is mainly just to save a few points and get some more strength. This will lead us to our actual intended mid-game tree. This is around where most people are going to land. There are additional trees here if you would like to add in cluster jewels, as well as a full end-game tree, which should be more powerful. But let's stick with this tree as we move forward and talk a little bit about the rest of the build. When it comes to the skills, you will see a variety of different skills that you have access to here. So for rolling magma, these are the set of skills that you'll be using. When it comes to the auras, do be careful about leveling clarity and vitality too much, especially as you get up into Act 2. You'll want to use Herald of Ash and then choose between either using vitality and clarity, or Herald of Ice, or Herald of Thunder. You're only going to have so much mana for each of these. Vitality and clarity is probably a little bit more comfortable, and you can be a little bit more lazy with it. And then everything else should be fine as you move through. There is also SRS leveling abilities here. They are slightly different, but mostly the same. Then we have our endgame skills, which you can look through here. This is all of the different skills that you'll be using, and as you get towards the endgame, you should try to transition to these abilities. The next set is going to be Awaken Gems plus level 20 gems. Notably, we don't have any of the Transfigured Gem information at this moment. I will update this as Path of Building does get updated. However, it hasn't made it there yet. I tried waiting as long as I could, but it just simply isn't out. Look forward to updates on that as soon as it's available. Now, talking about items, one thing I have done a little bit differently this time around is I have given you explanations of like early game items, explaining what you should be looking for, and making these special items which are essentially just trying to tell you about the early kinds of gear that you should get. When you're leveling through the campaign, you're just going to have to go off of whatever you can find. Realistically, I'm not going to be able to tell you exact pieces of gear to be able to get. You're going to have to work with what you've got. For rolling magma, for example, you'll want to use these crafted axes with 1.5 attack speed and low stat requirements, and craft this added fire damage to spells on them so that you can have a little bit more damage until you're able to transfer over to SRS. Alternatively, with Summon Raging Spirits, you're going to want to try to find Essences of Fear to craft a wand, and you're going to want to try to find Essences of Greed or Resist Essences to craft the rest of your defensive items as well. And then we'll move on into early budget / SSF gear. This is going to be very simple gear that you would craft with like random essences, buy off of the trade website in the first day or two, or simply find on the ground. It also includes very basic flasks with very basic modifiers on them. The mid-game gear, this is what I think that most people will probably end on and either finish up their league if they don't intend on pushing very far, or swapping over into their second character. This is going to be relatively straightforward to craft items, as well as some slightly more expensive items to grab from the trade website, including Eldritch Implicits. These items should be able to get you through most of the early pinnacle bosses without too much difficulty, as long as you learn their mechanics. Lastly, I do have a set of endgame gear. This is probably the most that I would say is worthwhile pushing on this build. You can go significantly further than this. You can go find someone like FaZe Plays guide, like his SRS deep dive video, which has a bunch of in-game crazy gear that'll cost you an arm and a leg, but this gear should be stuff that, as long as things don't get insanely popular on League Start, should maybe cost you about 20 divines by the end of week 1 or week 2. This is some relatively difficult to craft gear. However, beyond all of this gear, and in the notes, which are pretty extensive, which I'll go over a little bit in a moment, I do have crafting notes for basically every single piece of gear that I intend for you to craft. This explains to you multiple ways to do most pieces of gear, how to go about it the most efficient way, like how to roll flasks and all that kind of good stuff. So you should be able to obtain all these pieces of gear as long as you play enough and work on improving your character. Now let's talk about the notes. I've put quite a bit of work into these. It's basically like a whole website that I've written of notes for this build. We've got various things in here. there, an introduction talking about a few things. If you are interested in using Anime Guardians Inspectors, I don't recommend them as they are annoying and frustrating to use, but I have given you all the information that you will need in this little section here. I do talk a bit about the Affliction Ascendancies that are available and what my thoughts on them are. The TLDR is that early on, Warden of the Magi is probably really good for going fast, and Wildwood Primalist is almost assuredly going to be better in endgame because random extra Ascendancies are going to be insanely strong. As for the Warlock of the Mists, it really depends on this dark effigy of soul splitting or whatever it is on whether or not this is going to be good for the build. I have a bunch of frequently asked questions here. If you have like random things that you aren't sure about, you can go through here and see if the answer is in these FAQs. If not, you can always join my Discord and look at the dedicated thread for this build. I try to answer questions in there when I can. We've got leveling options, and I've shown you as you go through the campaign at what level, what quest, and what act you get each and every gem that's used in this build, any items that you should be looking out for from quests like Quicksilver Flask from Mercy Mission, as well as like Quicksilver Flask 2 from the Great White Beast, the other flasks that you're looking for, all the abilities, when to do your labs, all those kinds of good things throughout the entirety of the act, giving you a basic explanation of how the endgame works, and talking about the basic explanation of how the build functions at different levels of the game, different ways that you should play and such, and then of course, like I said earlier, all of the gearing and crafting information down here below. And that's going to be it for the video. If there's anything that I've missed or any improvements you think that I can make to the build, feel free to let me know over on Discord so I can update the POB to be as good as it possibly can. I've done my best to make sure that this POB should be as detailed as I possibly can get it. However, I'm only one guy. I don't have any help from anybody else, so this is about the best that I could do with the time that I was given. This next league looks like one of the most impressive and interesting leagues I think we've ever had. Just the sheer amount of new abilities that we're going to be able to play with is absolutely insane, and it's the thing I've been asking for longer than I can remember. This is the league where we're going to have like probably 3 or 4 months to play like 100 different builds, so it should be a lot of fun. I hope this build works out for you, and I hope that you have a good league start in 3.23 Affliction League. And remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Raid Class, and I'll see you guys in the next video.